In 1965, Boeing engineers made a decision that would create one of the most recognizable aircraft silhouettes in history. But here's the strange part. The feature they created wasn't designed for the reason you think. It wasn't for first class. It wasn't for extra passengers. It wasn't originally about giving passengers a better experience at all. It was about solving a loading problem on the ground. Almost everyone has an explanation for why the 747 looks the way it does. Luxury seating, aerodynamics, Boeing just wanting to look different. Every one of those explanations misses what actually happened. The truth begins with a canceled supersonic dream, a scaled-back double-decker, and a cargo door almost no passenger ever thought about. You already know the shape, that distinctive bulge rising above the forward fuselage, instantly recognizable from a mile away, copied in toy models, cartoons, and children's drawings of an airplane everywhere. It belongs to one aircraft, the only major commercial passenger airliner with that unmistakable silhouette, the Boeing 747. And almost everything most people assume about that hump is wrong. It wasn't built to look elegant, and the original hump wasn't created to add seats. To understand the hump, rewind to the mid-1960s. Pan Am wanted an aircraft more than twice the size of anything flying commercially. Boeing said yes before much of the detailed engineering had even begun. Here's the detail that changes everything. Boeing wasn't trying to build the world's greatest passenger airplane. At least, not forever. They believed something else was coming. Supersonic travel. And that single assumption quietly shaped everything about this aircraft. Boeing's engineers, led by a designer named Joe Sutter, expected supersonic transports would eventually dominate long-haul passenger travel, which would make the 747 increasingly valuable as a freighter later in its life. Concorde was already in development, and Boeing itself was racing to build its own supersonic transport, the 2707. Boeing wasn't designing the 747 assuming the passenger version would fail. They were designing it around the belief the market would evolve towards supersonic travel, and that this aircraft would need a profitable second career hauling freight. That assumption changed everything about how it was engineered, and it's the real origin of the hump. Here's the engineering problem cargo aircraft face that passenger jets never deal with. Imagine trying to load something the size of a jet engine or a piece of heavy industrial machinery through the side door of an airplane. For cargo that large, that's often not practical. One of the most practical ways to move something that big is straight through the front, like driving a truck into a tunnel. Boeing wanted that option built into the design, the ability to load oversized cargo directly through the nose, which meant the entire nose section needed to hinge open. But if the nose swings open, where do you put the cockpit? You can't leave it sitting in the space that needs to hinge outward. It would be directly in the way every single time ground crews loaded the plane. So Boeing moved it. They lifted the cockpit up and out of the loading path entirely, placing it above the main fuselage. That elevation is the hump. It primarily existed so ground crews could raise the hinged nose section and slide cargo straight through the fuselage without a cockpit in the way. One of the most photographed shapes in aviation history exists because Boeing engineers needed somewhere to put pilots out of the way of a giant nose-loading cargo door. But moving the cockpit wasn't as simple as just putting it upstairs. Boeing had to redesign the aircraft's structure, pressure cabin, and internal layout to make it work, all to support one primary decision: keeping the nose clear for a future nose-loading door. Most distinctive aircraft features exist because of aerodynamics or fuel efficiency. The 747's shape exists because of a decision about how forklifts and cargo pallets would move through the fuselage, one of the very few iconic aircraft shapes driven primarily by ground logistics rather than flight performance. Here's where the story gets even stranger. The hump we know today was actually a scaled-back version of something far more ambitious. Joe Sutter's team studied numerous configurations before settling on the one that flew, and some early studies explored much larger upper decks. This wasn't one finalized design that got dramatically canceled. It was one of dozens of evolving concepts Boeing weighed before narrowing things down. On paper, a larger upper deck looked appealing. More space, more revenue per flight, a shorter fuselage. But a full-length second deck ran into a serious problem. Safety regulations required any new aircraft to evacuate fully within 90 seconds, using only half its exits. and a full-length upper deck made that far more challenging, relying on limited stairwells to move people down to ground-level exits quickly. It wasn't the only factor, though. Structural weight, center of gravity, manufacturing complexity, and passenger flow during boarding all mattered too. So the larger upper deck concepts were set aside. What Boeing settled on was a shortened upper section, just long enough for the cockpit and a small cabin behind it. A compromise between cargo requirements, structural considerations, and evacuation rules. Not one dramatic regulation that killed a single finished design. Many people assumed the small upper deck was simply a first-class cabin Boeing designed in from the start. Not quite. Once Boeing settled on the elevated cockpit, that space was understood to be usable, and Boeing anticipated airlines would do something with it. It was space created by the cockpit relocation. One Boeing and airlines then worked out how to use afterward. But that wasn't the end of it. That shortened upper deck was about to create something Boeing never planned for at all. Once the cockpit moved upstairs, the forward section of the main deck below it became empty usable space. Airlines installed a small handful of seats there, producing something almost nowhere else in commercial aviation. Passengers occupying the extreme nose of the aircraft, directly beneath the elevated flight deck, further toward the tip of the plane than the cockpit itself, because the cockpit now sat above them rather than ahead of them. For decades, those seats were some of the most sought after on the aircraft. This is also where the Hump's shape started to change, as airlines realized that upper deck was a genuine asset. Early 747-100 and 747-200 models had a relatively short upper deck. The 747-300 introduced a stretch version for more seating, growing more pronounced with the 747-400, and reaching its most dramatic form with the 747-8, where the extension makes the aircraft look much closer to a true partial double-decker. The hump on a 747-100 from 1970 and a 747-8 from 2011 aren't the same shape. They grew across 4 decades of production. And here's the twist. Boeing's biggest assumption turned out to be completely wrong. Supersonic travel never took over. Yet the decision it inspired became one of the greatest strengths the aircraft ever had. The 2707 was terminated in 1971 after Congress withdrew federal funding over sonic booms, noise, and spiraling costs. Concorde did enter service, but remained a small, niche operation flown by only 2 airlines, never coming close to replacing subsonic jets. So why keep the hump at all? Because the design didn't need to be redrawn, the elevated cockpit and hinged nose were still structurally sound, and cargo capability remained genuinely important throughout. 747 freighters became a major, lasting part of the aircraft's business. What changed is that airlines also found a second, unexpected use for the extra space. Premium seating and lounges upstairs, marketed as an experience in its own right. Supersonic travel became the footnote, and the 747 became one of the most successful passenger airliners in history. And then Boeing's accidental cockpit compromise turned into something nobody expected. One of the most exclusive lounges in the sky. For roughly the 1970s through the early 1990s, several airlines treated that upper deck as genuine premium real estate. Pan Am, Continental, and Qantas installed cocktail lounges upstairs, complete with bar service and lounge seating arranged like a private club rather than an airliner cabin. That era eventually faded as airlines converted the space into additional business or first-class seating as competition on premium routes intensified. For 2 decades, the most recognizable shape in commercial aviation was home to some of the most unusual social spaces ever installed on a passenger aircraft. Space that existed primarily because a cockpit needed somewhere to go. That swing-nose cargo door design, the primary reason the hump exists, is still in daily use today. Many retired passenger 747s have been converted into freighters, and Boeing also built a huge number as purpose-built freighters straight from the factory. The nose loading capability remains one of the most efficient ways to move oversized cargo, from engine parts to humanitarian aid, at cargo hubs around the world. Side-loading cargo aircraft load freight through doors along the fuselage, fine for standard containers, far more difficult for anything unusually long. A nose-loading 747 can drive oversized freight straight through the front in one line. A major reason operators like Atlas Air, Cargolux, and UPS kept flying 747 freighters long after passenger airlines retired theirs. Boeing's engineers in the 1960s were wrong about supersonic jets taking over, but they were right about something else. Cargo capability became one of the aircraft's greatest long-term strengths, not just a fallback plan. Step back and look at the sequence. Boeing believed supersonic travel would take over from subsonic jets, so they designed for cargo conversion. That forced the cockpit upward. Evacuation rules, structural concerns, and manufacturing practicality then narrowed an ambitious upper deck down to the small section that actually flew, which created some of the most desirable seats in aviation history. And that original cargo-focused thinking is exactly what kept 747 freighters flying decades after most passenger versions retired. Cargo conversion was planned from the start, but the upper deck lounges, the coveted nose seats, and decades of premium branding built on top of that space were not. And yet it produced a shape so recognizable that most people who have never set foot near an airport could still sketch it from memory. No other major commercial passenger airliner has ever replicated this shape. Airbus eventually built its own super jumbo, the A380, with a genuine full-length double deck. The concept Boeing had scaled back in the 1960s, but the A380 achieved that with an entirely new fuselage from a clean sheet in the 2000s. A wider cross-section, multiple staircases, far more exits, and evacuation modeling that didn't exist in 1965. It never took on a silhouette like the 747's Hump because it was engineered as a full double-decker from the outset, not a single-deck aircraft with a cockpit added on top. The 747 wasn't the only aircraft ever built with a raised cockpit above a nose-loading cargo door. Military transports like the Lockheed C-5 Galaxy and the Antonov N-124 use a similar arrangement for exactly the same reason. What makes the 747 unique is that it remains the only major passenger airliner built around it, carrying tens of millions of ordinary travelers through a design solution originally worked out for moving freight. That's the heart of why the 747's shape has stayed one of a kind among passenger jets. It's the fingerprint of a specific set of problems, solved in a specific order, under a particular set of assumptions about where aviation was heading in 1965. Change any one of those variables, and you likely never get this shape at all. Did you know the Hump started out as a cargo door solution, or did you always assume it was designed for first class? Drop a comment and let me know what surprised you most. And if you've ever flown on a 747, especially in that upper deck or those forward nose seats, I'd love to hear what that experience was like. Remove any one of those steps, the supersonic bet, the cargo requirement, the evacuation rules, the airline's later use of that space, and the 747 most likely looks like every other airliner of its era. More than half a century later, the Boeing 747 is slowly disappearing from passenger skies. But every time one of those unmistakable humps appears on the horizon, you're looking at the legacy of one engineering decision made in the 1960s. Not for luxury, not for first class, but for a cargo door that most passengers never even knew existed. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the 747's most famous feature, subscribe for more hidden histories of the aircraft that shaped modern aviation. And let me know in the comments, what other iconic aircraft feature do you want us to dig into next? The DC-10's tail-mounted engine, Concorde's drooping nose, the 787's raked wingtips? Tell me below.